Gamel Abdel Nasser stands as the most prominent and charismatic Arab leader of the 20th century. He rose through the ranks of the Egyptian military and served as a young officer in the 1948 war in Palestine. And it's from that time forward that Nasser began to discuss politics rather than just military strategy with his fellow officers. They said that they were fighting in Palestine, but that their struggle really was to try and reform Egypt. And that would lead to a revolution that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy in 1952, headed by a group of reformist officers, the most influential of whom was, of course, Nasser himself. And his language of a common Arab purpose and of Arab nationalism just electrified the masses from one end of the Arab world to the other. It was a whole combination of politics and policies. On the one hand, trying to bring reform to Egypt. On the other hand, to try and arm Egypt in its struggle against Israel, which was a very dangerous neighbor for Egypt. And on the other hand, to try and encourage common Arab action among other Arab states. So we see things like Nasser's attempt to bring electrification and power to Egypt through the Aswan Dam, leading to a funding package backed by the United States and Britain. But Britain and America were using their support for the Aswan Dam as a way to put some controls and limits on Nasser's action and force him to engage with the West against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. When Nasser turned to the USSR for weapons, the British and the Americans dropped him like a hot potato. They pulled the funding for the Aswan Dam project, and it was clearly a bid to destabilize Nasser and overturn him. But Nasser was able to turn that humiliation to victory. Within the week, he actually nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital strategic waterway that was Egyptian territory.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves.
But this set off a series of sort of political crises that ultimately would take Egypt into an unprovoked war in which Britain, France, and Israel basically conspired to war on Egypt to topple Nasser.
As Israel, in a lightning attack, thrusts deep into Egypt to the vicinity of the canal. Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
And so you had this wild roller coaster ride of Nasserist initiatives that lead to unwanted confrontations with either the West or with Israel. And yet each time he seemed to come out of these crises in a stronger position. The Suez Crisis is a great example. He lost a war militarily, but won a great diplomatic victory when the collusion of Britain, France, and Israel was made apparent, and all these parties were forced to withdraw from Egypt. What this meant was Nasser's standing in the Arab world was unrivaled as someone who had brazened the power of the West and survived. When instability struck a country like Syria, its political elites basically threw their country at his feet. And in 1958, Egypt and Syria united in one country called the United Arab Republic.
Two presidents, Gamel Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Shukri al-Quwatli of Syria, meet to make history in Cairo with the federation of their two states into one, the United Arab Republic.
And it was a very sort of emotional moment for Arab nationalists because it seemed that for the very first time, a meaningful union between Arab states would overturn the boundaries imposed by imperialism. This was the Arabs, under Nasser's stewardship, finally seizing control of their own destinies. In many ways, it was the high point of Arab nationalism. And I'm afraid that events from that point forward were to prove the disappointment of the hopes of Arab nationalists. The UAR did not survive. It collapsed in 1961. no other countries ultimately signed on to the project of union with Egypt and Syria. And so the Middle East fell back to a reality of smaller nation states. But I think for the 1950s, the hopes of Arab nationalists were embodied by just about everything that Gamel Abdel Nasser did.